Swinging a drive. Right field and deep. Back goes Aquino. It's got a chance. Gone. Get out the tape measure. Long gone.
Fly the W!
Cubs fans, it's time to fly the W with Dustin Rhodes and Paul Crawley-Jean.
You are listening to the Fly the W podcast. Don't forget to listen, download, review, and subscribe to the Fly the W podcast. Leave those 5-star reviews, and you can email us at flythew670@gmail.com. Ladies and gentlemen, we got a real treat for you here tonight. We have the editor-in-chief of Cubs Insider, Evan Altman. Evan, how you doing?
I'm good. It's, outside of it being like freezing rain, I was just down in Tampa for a couple days, and now I come back to nasty Midwest weather. So, and it was, when I left, it was like 60 and sunny here. My son's team had baseball practice outside on the day when I have to fly down to Tampa. And then when I come back, I get this weather. So I don't know. I could be doing better. I could be doing worse.
We met our annual meetup at CubsCon on Friday at Lizzie McNeil's, and actually CubsCon wasn't that bad weather-wise. Usually it's a lot more miserable, but I got a feeling like you probably have an Arizona trip coming up pretty soon, right?
Yeah, it's going to be, what are we at? I guess about a month and a half. I think I'll be there kind of later in the spring, 21st to the 25th, somewhere in that. Cubs have a nice little stretch of home games there right before my kids are, part of it, spring break kind of falling, so it makes it a little bit easier. I've got some other things lined up. So, yeah, looking forward to just spending a couple days out there. That's always one of the highlights of my year, just kind of going out and relaxing, kind of watching some games that in and of themselves don't necessarily matter, but then kind of like what you said, it's sort of a miniature CubsCon in terms of just getting catching up with a bunch of folks that maybe I don't get to see that often, and going down to the backfield, just kind of walking around and enjoying baseball. So yeah, really looking forward to that.
Over down by John Arguello way, right?
Oh, absolutely.
It's hard. I'm not going to spring training this year, and it's like, oh man, but I've never been to Chase Field in Phoenix. I've never seen a game there. And so the Cubs are opening up their stateside campaign there the 27th. So I'm going to be there. People laugh. I've been to Arizona numerous times, but I've never been anywhere other than ballparks and bars. And people are like, there's like more than ballparks and bars in Arizona. I'm like, yeah, really? So this year I'm going to Sedona. So okay. I'm going to do a week in Sedona, and then I'm heading out to go check out, like I said, Chase Field. I'm hoping I can get the pool for the second day, but we'll see what happens. But like, how awesome would that be if I got to just be in a Speedo and kind of strut around Chase Field, man?
I don't know. It might be awesome for you. I don't know about the other 25,000, 30,000 people there, but hey, if we'll be looking for you. It'll be easy to spot, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. Now, the reason I wanted to have you on, Evan, besides picking your brilliant baseball brain, is that you saw the same tweet that I did. And this was the tweet that kind of talked about the number of days that your team, whatever team it is, and us being Cubs fans, has been in first place since 2020. And when you look at it for the Cubs, it doesn't look great there, falling in at number 18 at 92. And I got to tell you, Evan, the one thing that bothers me more than anything, and I know it probably shouldn't, like worry about your own team, but seeing the Houston Astros at 328 days, that's what we were supposed to be. That was that dynasty that we thought it would be, and Houston really kind of did it, and the Cubs didn't,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, and I kind of wrote about that in a separate piece too, to where it's part of that was, it started as kind of a joke, right? Because the Cubs have gone out and acquired Kyle Tucker. Then they got Ryan Presley. Now there's the possibility of getting Alex Bregman. There's other guys that they've been looking at. And so it's like the Cubs tried, effectively they did. The Cubs and the Astros were almost parallel. The Astros maybe got started a year earlier, but they've experienced quite a bit more success. They've been to more World Series. They've won more World Series. They've done a much better job of not only developing the players that they had who were the early draft picks, but also finding those diamonds in the rough like Jose Altuve. The Cubs, on the other hand, have done a very poor job of developing anybody outside of their really high first-round draft picks that they've had historically. So you look at that and you're kind of like, it's that sustained success that the Cubs were promising us. And I'm upset by that. I'm also upset by looking at the Brewers up there as second to only the Dodgers in terms of how much. And, people say, well, what if the Brewers won? And while the answer is really nothing outside of, a playoff series, I think, right? That's about it.
Yep.
But that's missing the point. The point is that you're supposed to put yourself in a position to be competitive every single year. And we've seen so many times, whether it be the Diamondbacks or, the Phillies when they kind of busted through, or the Nats when they won their World Series. Like, the ball just has to bounce your way a couple times, and sometimes it doesn't, and that's bad luck. But you put yourself there. Luck is what happens. Preparation meets opportunity. The Brewers have created far more opportunities over the last 5 seasons than the Cubs had.
And in your article, you talk about how the Brewers have led the Central for 468 days, and that being 169 more days than the Cardinals, the Cubs, the Pirates, and the Reds combined. Yeah. I mean, and I remember just sitting there last year, and even Pacoda, like, we were looking at this, we were talking about this the other day, you lost Corbin Burns, you lost Josh Hader, you lost Craig Counsell. This is the year that the Brewers are going to kind of go down. And it's like, nope, they're still there. And not only that, they're doing it while spending a lot less money.
Yeah, to me, that's the frustrating part, right? Is that whether the Cubs have ever wanted to admit it, and they haven't wanted to, about, are they in a rebuild? What exactly is this? The fact remains that even in their down years, spending wise, they're outspending everybody else in the division. The Cardinals are $60 million less if you look at aggregate over those 5 years, which isn't a huge gap, but it's a massive gap to what the Brewers have spent, the Reds have spent, the Pirates have spent. And now we're seeing those teams, right? The Reds look like they're trying to be for real, bringing in Tito. The Pirates have done a great job of getting guys like Paul Skeens, some other hard throwers. So these are not teams that are pushovers. And so when you look at it, and I think the other thing in that time, the part that's really troubling to me is, of those 92 days the Cubs have led the division, 56 of them came in the short 2020 season. So they've only led the division for 36 total days the last 4 years. That almost feels like you could make it happen by accident, right? Like that doesn't even feel like you're trying that hard.
Right. And I think, like, the Pirates probably have equivalent numbers to that. And so here's the thing that I kind of sit there and wonder, Evan, is obviously, Theo Epstein steps down November 17th, 2020, right? And he steps down from the role of president of baseball ops, and his number 2, right? The Robin to his Batman, the Watson to his Holmes, the ODB to his Method Man, right? Jed Hoyer, I had to put that in for you there. Yes, but he comes in, and, how much of this is Jed? How much of it is ownership? It's kind of like, is it the chicken or the egg? What came first? It's kind of like, did Theo leave noticing? Because we all noticed how in 2018, all of a sudden it seemed like the pocketbook closed up. And since then, we've heard the terms biblical losses, breaking even, all this stuff. It's just this constant reminder that we're not the Dodgers. We can't compete with those, all these things. And so I'm just wondering, would you say that Jed is doing an okay job based on the resources he's allocated, or would you say he's underperforming?
I mean, it's hard based on what I just said, right? And again, as you noted there, that 2020 season, which makes up more than half of those days easily that they've been in the lead, those came under Theo Epstein's ultimate leadership, right? And so Jed Hoyer has led the division less than the last 4 years under his leadership than Theo Epstein did for his final year. So I think the issue here, and it's really hard to come through if we talk about, kind of threading the needle. That's a phrase Hoyer likes to use a lot. And it's kind of a fancy way of saying to, make the most out of what we got, right? You have a smaller, if the eye of the needle is fairly small, it's going to be harder to thread. And so I do think, have there been some financial restrictions at times? Yes. But again, if we look at it relative to the Dodgers or the Mets or somebody like that, I think it's easy to look at it and say, well, Tom Ricketts isn't spending enough money. But then when you look at the division that they're in, with the Cubs being by far the largest market, and again, by far the most financial might, even when they're not spending to what a lot of people believe should be their capacity, it's hard to look at that and excuse the fact that they're not winning the division year after year. And so I've felt that, Theo Epstein was a really aggressive leader, right? Like he showed that with Boston. They kind of rewrote the way Moneyball worked. We saw him when he came into Chicago, taking some really big swings on guys, right? The biggest contracts in franchise history remain those that he signed outside of now Dansby Swanson, but that's really the Cubs' only marquee contract right now. No pun intended, right? And so it seemed like Hoyer was the guy who kind of tempered Theo Epstein. Like Epstein would maybe be a little bit more impulsive. Jed would come in and kind of balance him a little bit. And when you don't have that aggressive, I don't see Carter Hawkins as being that aggressive force to kind of balance out Hoyer. And so I think overall, we've seen this front office trend toward, lower ceilings, higher floors, and there just aren't as many. When he talks about trying to outperform expectations, that's great. And it's something that happens with every team that is successful, but they've compiled a roster that, outside now of Tucker, doesn't have a lot of guys who really have these high ceilings that they could reach. And so you're left with this team that, as we've seen the last couple of years, is just relatively mediocre. 83 wins, you're above 500, but not enough to be dangerous.
And so Jed is I don't know if he's, as far as what you can credit him with, like when we take a look at the farm system, he comes in 2021, and that's the year that they're going, everybody's contracts up. Bryant, Baez, Rizzo. He finally admitted the Schwarber mistake. But when you think about those guys being gone and rebuilding the farm system, in 2020, the Cubs were 21st. This just came out on Baseball America, right? So 2020, they were 21st is farm systems, 2021, 22nd. 2022, 15, 2023, 17. And then last season they were 4th, but now they're back kind of in that 15, in that mid-range right now. How much credit do you think Jed gets for the development of the farm system? I mean, there are 7 Cubs prospects in the top 100. They don't have that super high-end talent, that transcendent player, but they do have a lot of really good players in the system.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly gets some credit, but there again, I look at the Yu Darvish trade, and Owen Casey's the only player remaining in the system from that deal for a bunch of young guys. You look at some of the other trades that have worked out, like what's happening right now with the Chris Bryant trade. Caleb Killian hasn't been able to do much at the major league level, despite what he's shown in the minors. Alexander Canario looks like a guy without a spot anymore, as other guys have kind of exceeded that. I would give more of that credit to Dan Kantrovitz, who they brought in to run their draft. I mean, and Hoyer gets credit for that, right? Like he was part of that hire. He is Kantrovitz's boss, so to some extent. But I think more of the work that's been done is on the player evaluation side with guys that they're drafting or signing as international free agents. I have yet to see, again, they were praised so much for flipping Scott Effross, kind of the way they changed him up and managed to get Hayden Wesneski. But then again, he was incredibly inconsistent. Now he's out as part of that Kyle Tucker deal. So I don't really have a whole lot that I can say positively about the guys that have been acquired in all those trades outside of Pete Crow Armstrong. Like that's the one shining example of it felt like they really robbed the Mets, especially for how little the Mets got in terms of Javi Baez, basically, right? And so I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of this, and again, we're talking about top draft picks. We're talking about guys who were Matt Shaw and Cade Horton, who were taken among, in the first half of the draft. And there were college guys, a little more polished, who should move quickly. I still don't feel like we're seeing a whole lot of this with guys who were drafted lower, second round and beyond, or who maybe needed a little bit more polish to work through the system. And then what did that become? Because right now, again, outside of PCA, we really haven't seen an impact at the major league level yet, and we're still waiting on that.
Boy, I remember that Javi Baez trade, and you thought, boy, going to New York and getting to play with Francisco Lindor, like, couldn't have been any more perfect. And boy, was that just a flop. But, obviously now that Jed's a little bit of I don't want to say a dead man walking, but as Joe Madden infamously said, it's my free agent year. It's Jed's free agent year. And so I don't think there's anyone that doesn't believe that if he doesn't make the postseason, he's gone, right?
I mean, I look at that a couple different ways. because and this could depend too, your opinion on this, your mileage may vary, but I'm not completely sold, as obvious as this would be to some people, or some it might fly directly in their face, but I don't know that ownership's primary goal is actually winning, at least not on a large scale. I think it's to keep a team that looks competent enough to keep butts in the seats and keep people engaged and buying marquee subscriptions. And so if Jed Hoyer does a good job of that. Now, if we see another situation where he goes over the luxury tax and gets into penalties and they only win 83 games as a result, that I think is a different story. But if they produce a team but that said, it is absolute malpractice given what we've talked about with the division, given how much money they're spending, given the acquisitions that they made and the projections that are out there, as much as you want to trust those. They kind of not making the postseason would be a damning indictment of anyone else. Although I don't often see the Cubs from a top-down perspective as being entirely focused on, again, not just spending but the Mets and the Dodgers do not have room for failure, where they're going to either outspend it or they're going to start over and put more money into it and then do what needs to be done. The Cubs have not shown that they're willing and able to do that. So I don't know that it's necessarily a fireable offense if they don't make it. It should be. I don't know that it is.
No, you talked about Jed being kind of more of the, tempering Theo Epstein type thing, but that Kyle Tucker move was pretty surprising for Jed, knowing Jed and how he operates. 1 year of control for Kyle Tucker, and you gave up Cam Smith and, Isaac Paredes and Hayden Wesniewski we talked about, but do you think that was a move that Jed, say if he had 5 more years on his contract, would have made? Or do you think that maybe there was a little bit of added pressure to try to make this, to get that 4 or 5 WAR player in this lineup?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely indicative of someone who knows that it may not necessarily be do or die, but he can't have another season like the last 2. And again, it goes to exactly what I had said when he made that statement about having players who need to outperform their expectations. That was made well before Kyle Tucker was in the fold. Right now, they might have been looking at him, but certainly they weren't aiming at that. And so that is a guy who, if you look at, and I think PCA is one of them that's got a very, very high ceiling if he continues to hit like he did in the second half. I think that's another guy who, could give you an extra 2, 3, 4 wins, right? But Tucker is that kind of a guy who can be a difference maker, even if it is only for 1 season, because at this point, I think rather than, if you got a 5-year contract, you can afford to look at years 3 and 4 as kind of where we really want to make things happen, right? But when you do when you're kind of a lame duck, you really don't have much of a choice. And so, yeah, I thought the Morel for Paredes trade was one of those two that was a little bit more aggressive than we were used to seeing Hoyer make at the time, right? To swing that deal. And so this is kind of that coming full circle. And if they're able to do something with Alex Bregman, then that becomes another kind of a move that is kind of out of character for what Hoyer has done. Even if we do compare it to Cody Bellinger, I think this is a different story. So, yeah, I mean, I think he's definitely got to push his chips in, because one way or the other, he's got to win.
And so now we take a look at this offseason, and we talked about Kyle Tucker, but you got Ryan Presley, Matthew Boyd, Carson Kelly, John Birdie, you got bench options, you got Eli Morgan, you got Ryan Brazier, who they just added. I mean, as far as looking at this offseason right now, Bregman can change everything right away. But what grade would you give Jed Hoyer right now for this 2025 offseason?
I'll give him a solid B minus even. I'm a little concerned with some of what they didn't pursue. When we look at the Tanner Scott deal and how that kind of got away from them, and how it certainly seemed as though Scott wanted to be in Chicago, but there's a lot of temporary measures, right? And that's the part that that concerns me, right? Because you could be left in the same situation all over again next winter, where you've still got to go replace all these guys, regardless of what level of success they achieve. And I think they're pretty well set up to do at least moderately well in the division, right? I think they'll be okay there. Playoffs are a different story, but I don't like having all these guys who were, again, just that 1 year. You can't really bank on anything. And you certainly, as much as prospect huggers, I'll call them that, would love to see every single prospect come up and be awesome and fill out the lineup. That's not realistic either. Like, it's not going to happen. And so I think there's still one or two more moves that have to be made, even if we're just talking like, and Bregman might be that, right, to where it's a 4-year deal, and I'm sure there'll be options, but that at least provide you a little bit of security and continuity, I think is really the big key going forward. So you're not just, it's not like a college basketball team where you have to refill everybody with NIL deals, every year. And I don't think that's really helpful. So I guess we'll see, but it's a B, because I think the division's weak enough that you don't have to have an A in order to win it.
And so we had Craig Goldstein on from baseball perspectives, 90 wins. Where would you put the Cubs as far as win total for this year in 2025?
I think that's fair. I think they've done enough to elevate. I think I think I actually nailed 83 2 years ago. I think I said 85 last year, and they came shy of that. But based on what I've seen, and I think the bullpen in particular, having that solid bullpen that's ideally, right, knock wood, not going to cost them so many games early on, that Craig Counsell doesn't have to figure out over 2 or 3 months, like, who do I have in here who I can trust, right? That circle of trust is built. So I think 90 is a pretty solid. 90 to 92, I'd probably be going that high on. I think it's about as high as I'll get, but that's a great season if that's the deal, and you can win the division with that and have, a meaningful run.
Now, obviously, the concern about having to do this all next year aside, right now, if you were to say my one fear of the 2025 season, injuries, we're not going to look in that, but if you had one fear or one area that you just think is really still deficient, where do you see this Cubs team still needing to add when you talk about adding pieces?
Yeah, I mean, I think my biggest concern is that they just in general, they still don't have a great deal of power, right? That is an area where they'll struggle. And even if Matt Shaw does what we think he can do, there's nobody there when we saw that success, when it happened in 2015, with Bryant and Schwarber and Baez all coming up, all living up to the hype all at once. Like, that, I think, ruined a lot of people's perspective on how things normally work with prospects. It doesn't usually happen to where you've got a guy who comes up and is, like, again, with KB, it's still kind of shocking to see how successful he was at every single level as he came up. There was no adjustment period, nothing. He just stepped right in, rookie of the year, MVP. You was on a pace to be an all-time great. Injuries kind of derailed that, and then the trade. But there's nobody in the system as good as we think Matt Shaw can be, or maybe you love you some Owen Casey or Kevin Alcantara. None of those guys is Chris Bryant. None of them's Anthony Rizzo. None of them's even Javi Baez. I don't want to short shrift Javi, because that's another guy who was MVP conversation for 2 or 3 seasons there. There's not even a Kyle Schwarber who you see moving up and providing, like, immediately coming up and providing that impact power. So that's what concerns me, is that the floor is high, as I said earlier. I just don't know who's there that markedly ratchets up the ceiling. And that's what this club needs more. You can't just have a bunch of guys who are good to very good. They need some great players, and I don't know where they find those outside of possibly, maybe one of those guys blossoms into that. I just don't know that I see it right now.
All right. And Craig Counsell, what are you looking for in year 2? Obviously, he has the lay of the land. What do you see happening as far as Craig Counsell this season? Do you think we're going to see kind of things operate a little bit differently this time around?
Yeah, I certainly hope so. And I kind of hinted at that earlier. It felt like, and again, this was a guy who had played for the Brewers, who had kind of hung around in their front office for a while before he became the manager, who had a little bit more say, I think, in not only, player acquisitions, but kind of development stuff, and seeing these guys come up through the system, was intimately familiar with the way the Brewers did things and who they had personnel wise, top to bottom. Coming into Chicago the way he did, he didn't have that same grasp of exactly who all these guys were. And so that's what I'm looking for a little bit more, him being more comfortable with that, having a better scope of kind of, here's my pitching staff in particular. Here are the guys who are going to really be, my ride or dies as far as the back end. And then here's how we can slot guys into the middle. So bullpen management is going to be, to me, the biggest thing, because that was the difference between them winning 83 games last year and possibly winning 90 plus if they just don't blow a bunch of those saves early on.
Well, Evan, I appreciate you jumping on, giving us a little time. Again, that article, if people are interested, is at Real Cub Insider, and that's where our listeners can find all of your work, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Just check out Cubs Insider. It's at Real Cubs Insider on Twitter. You want to just go search Cubs Insider out there. Look for us on Facebook, wherever you prefer to kind of take in your Cubs news, and we'll hopefully be there for you.
All right, Evan. And again, appreciate you jumping on, and hopefully, like I said, the Cubs exceed all our expectations.
Hope so, man. We'll keep our fingers crossed.